And then, as people trickle in, like I said, we'll certainly let them in. Okay. We're all in agreement. Okay. All right. So my name is Jen Edwards, and I'm the events coordinator at Poetry Society of New Hampshire. So thank you all for attending today. We are going to do a talk and event on poetry and sculpture. And today we have Brad Becker, Burkhart, Cheryl Latif, and their publisher, Jan Tucker. So I'm going to read through some of their bios and give us some basic information, and then turn that over to them to let them do a reading. And then we can have some time for answering questions. I also want to let you know we are going to record today's Zoom event. So I just wanted to make you all aware. And if people would like to turn off their videos, they are welcome to. Feel free to just, make yourself comfortable in your own way. If you need to take a break, feel free to turn on your camera, turn off your camera, just take care of you, whatever you need to do. And then we just ask that you do mute only because, sometimes background noise can make it challenging to hear the poems. So I may mute you guys as needed, but then there will be time at the end to ask questions. Feel free to also put questions or comments in the chat. David and I will be monitoring the chat and just kind of keeping track if questions come up at the end. And if people do need to leave early for some reason, that's okay. Just again, we just ask that you kind of quietly exit so it doesn't disrupt the reading. Thank you. Okay, so let's do our bios. So Brad Burkhart is a sculptor. He was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1949. He's lived in California for most of his adult life, in San Francisco, San Diego, and most recently, Santa Cruz. He attended Kalamazoo College in Western Michigan, where he graduated with a major in art and a minor in physics. He later received a Master of Landscape Architecture degree from the University of Michigan. Very interesting. As an undergrad, the artist traveled extensively in Europe and was profoundly impressed by Renaissance and medieval artists. He was struck by the change of human consciousness from one of spiritual orientation to one of intellectual orientation. More recently, he's been influenced by the writing of Joseph Campbell and various writers, which address the reintegration of intuition with rationality, as well as the writings of Susie Gablik about the lack of meaning in modern art. The artist has an interest in the relationship of nature and ecology, which has led him to become a leader in native habitat restoration in California. His art and restoration work both address the deep sense of alienation from self and nature, which exists today. Okay, Cheryl Latif. Before Seattle opened its arms to her, Cheryl Latif has made San Diego her home for 18 years. There, she ran a weekly poetry reading, which grew to having 100 attendees each week and featured poets from across the country and across the pond. A simple trip to Seattle to a Seattle Poetry Conference changed her life, and she set new roots in Seattle in 2001. Cheryl's poems have been featured in public arts exhibits and published in a number of journals and anthologies, including New Millennium Writings, the Comstock Review, Spillway, and How Luminous the Wildflowers. I'll also be attaching some links to bios and websites in the chat. And then their publisher, Jan Carpenter Tucker. Jan Carpenter Tucker is an editor and publisher who guides authors to self-publish beautiful and exquisitely edited, designed, and printed books through her company, Night Star Publisher. Jan is also a designer, creative director, and digital solutions specialist, serving a wide variety of clients through her company, J.L. Carpenter Design. Her signatures are bright, bold, colorful graphic treatments, and carefully crafted strategic communication. All right. And Brad, I'm handing it
Oh,
to you.
As the publisher, I'm going to just interrupt and tell you that Cheryl's last name is Latif, just so you know
Thank
this
you.
the pronunciation.
thanks for clarifying, Jan.
Okay.
So I'm the sculpture part of the project here. And I was just going to kind of generally introduce how this whole thing got started. About 20 years ago, I lived in San Diego at that time, and I had a number of, I had been doing a bunch of sketches since I had been in college, which I really didn't consider art. They were created by just randomly drawing lines on a piece of paper, and then these images would gradually develop, and I would refine them into finished images. In San Diego, I met a woman, a Brazilian sculptor named Joyce Schleniger, and she convinced me to translate these into these clay relief panels that I do now, that I've been doing for the last 20 years. And so I started doing these, and then I started noticing how people were reacting to these images because everyone has a different kind of imagery in it. And I noticed in particular that other artists were stimulated in their creativity. And so I did a couple of projects. One is still on my website called the Poetry Project. And the Poetry Project involved about 25 different poets from both Mexico and the United States who picked pieces of mine and wrote poems about them. And I also did a music project where I had a bunch of musicians who did the same thing. And I always wanted to create a book with one poet or one tape with one musician who would do a number of poems or compositions in response to my work. And but nothing ever happened, and time went by, and actually some of the poets moved away from San Diego, and I would get a notice every once in a while from one or the other of them. And about 2, 3 years ago now, Cheryl and I got back in touch. She was one of the original poets from the project, and she had since moved to Seattle, and I expressed my original wish, and she said, "Oh, yeah, I'd be interested in that." And I thought, I'm always trying to encourage anybody to be creative. So I thought, go ahead, it'll probably take her 10 years to write 4 poems. But all of a sudden, Cheryl started cranking them out. And before I knew it, she had created 40 poems in response to works of mine. And what was really interesting about the project is this was during COVID. So none of us who were involved with this project ever met in person until after COVID was over. And so Cheryl would review photos of my work online and then write poems in response to them. And sometimes I'd have to correct some of the imagery. I'd say, "Oh, well, that's not what you thought it was. It's something else. It's an elephant or instead of a mouse or something." So we worked together. And then it turned out right at this time, Cheryl, who's been close friends with Jan, said, "Oh, I have this editor in San Diego who would be interested in helping us put this book together." And coincidentally, so she introduced me to Jan, and we started working together again over Zoom presentations. Jan put the whole book together basically without us seeing it in person until it was first shipped to us at our houses. And it was interesting because Jan and I had a number of sort of synchronistic connections through my work in habitat restoration in San Diego. In fact, one of the people she had done a book for, he was somebody who I had been a competitor of mine in the habitat restoration community, and I had worked on a number of projects right next to his in San Diego. So it was a very interesting connection, and Jan really got into it, and I have to say, mostly donated most of her work to us very graciously, but also excitedly, because she got real lit up by this project and just did an incredible job putting it together. And I'm hoping toward the end here of our presentation that Jan can talk a little bit about some of the issues around publishing, because some of your folks may very well want to correspond with her to ask questions about publishing and that. we ended up going with an online publisher called BookBaby, and we got a really good support from them. And so that's kind of the background of the project. And I want to kind of turn it over to Cheryl now so she can talk about how she got involved with the project and then read some of the poems. And when she gets ready to read, I'll have Jen share her desktop with me, and I'll actually have the poems up for view for everybody. Cheryl?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yes, this has been quite a process. And, when I discovered that Brad had been looking for somebody to do something like this with him for 20 years, I thought, wow, because for me, it wasn't even a question. It's like, yeah, let's do that. And so he sent me photographs of a bunch of his sculptures, and I chose certain sculptures that spoke to me on some level or another, and then wrote poems about them. And as Brad said, there were times where he'd say, no, 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 this image is different than what you're seeing or what you think. And I mean, some of his work is very deep in terms of different images and ways that it all comes together. And yet it was fun. It was really fun to just look at these sculptures and, write about them. And the interesting thing is that, obviously the book's been out now for a little while, but I can remember somebody saying, well, these are all very positive. The poems are really positive, and which is not, it's not something that I did on purpose per se. I just went with what I felt. And indeed, that's what ended up happening, which, I mean, even writing a poem about a warrior ended up being a positive poem.
Yeah, I was like, Jan, isn't there anything dark here or anything? And then I stood back and I thought, it's right during COVID, and we really need this positivity, and I'm going to go with it. So that's what she did.
Yeah, and I didn't even see it that way per se, but I think you're right, Brad. We're dealing with so much as a society right then. And just I was pretty amazed at how smoothly everything went. And we all worked together so well. And of course, Jan and I, Jan and I worked together for years. I was a copywriter, she was a graphic artist, and we did all kinds of stuff together that way. And, just as the years went on, we had all these different ways of working together, and a very wonderful, deep friendship. So it's been a nice coming together, the three of us.
So you want to maybe segue into a couple of poems here, Cheryl?
Sure. I will start with the first poem in the book.
Need you to share your desktop with me, Jen. Can you do that? You are screen sharing. Okay, good. Hang on just a sec. Can everybody see this?
I can see it.
Yep,
Okay.
looks good.
So that's the first poem. A very interesting piece. I did a project at the end of 2002 and 2003 when we entered the war in Iraq. And it was called the Rosecrans series, and it's on my website. And what had happened is in the fall of 2002, I had a naming session. I name my pieces with groups of people who get together and they talk until a consensus is reached. And that's where the names come from. And the name of the piece that we had named was called The Passing of the Warrior Class. And it looked a little bit like that Hokusai wave print that many of you are probably familiar with. But I could not figure out what the passing of the warrior class, the name had to do with this piece. But then I sort of stood back and I realized we were just about to go into the war in Iraq. And if you remember, there were all these protests all over the world, France, Australia, India, don't go into this war. And I thought maybe humanity is getting to a point where they no longer will need war as a way to solve their problems. Apparently a naive notion at the moment. But at any case, I came up with this project, which I've been interested in connecting art with solving problems that science has trouble with, and war was one of those. And so the project involved me going to the Rosecrans Military Cemetery in San Diego, where there's 80,000 soldiers buried from every war we fought, and finding and sitting on the graves of the soldiers, not only who had fought in these wars, but who had died in these wars, and sketching as I asked the dead soldiers, how do we get past war? And there was a series of 14 sculptures that came out of this. So that's kind of the background behind this piece. And interestingly enough, this piece, originally, a lot of them were named, they had kind of more somber names. Like this piece originally was called An Unnatural But All Too Common Beginning, perhaps referring to war itself. But when Cheryl began to write this poem, she called it Joyful Imagination. And what was interesting is it just struck me that, yes, this was what it was really about. And so I actually changed the name to Joyful Imagination. And shortly after that, this piece was purchased by a writer at the Silicon Valley Open Studios who had writer's block. And she said, I have to have this piece to get past my writer's block. So anyway, that's the introduction to Joyful Imagination. I'll let Cheryl read.
Well, I want to say also that there are several of the poems in the book that the names of the sculpture and the names of the poem do not, they're not the same. And in some cases, as in this one, Brad actually changed the name of the sculpture. But anyway, so this is Joyful Imagination. There is no hiding the force of goodness, the strength of connection, the timeless understanding of what is and what may be. It is written on your face and mine, hovers above each of us with promise to be embraced as we walk this path with friends amid chirping birds, playful pets, the sound of music filling the air, filling our heads with the delight we are called to share. After all, we must start somewhere.
Okay.
Is it, I would like to, a couple of things I just want to mention about this piece. What happened? We lost the panel.
I know I'm
Okay.
screwed up here. I'm trying to get it back up again.
Okay.
Sorry.
But one thing is that what we're looking at is PDF files of the book. The actual, and I'm noticing that it's kind of created some little lines that go through the art. and maybe no one else noticed that, but if you did, that's a condition of the PDF file. The actual printed piece doesn't have that flaw. And also this this piece was so delightful to everyone, obviously, that was working on it. Brad himself loves his piece. Cheryl loved it, and her poetry reflects that. And the poem and the sculpture for me were so delightful. They seemed to be the piece that would introduce the book, and that's why we chose that as the cover image. And you see, we had to, Brad was great about providing these little cutout clips of various pieces from the sculpture. And I took that then and kind of had to make some adjustments to it so that it would work as a cover. But also, I wanted the artwork on the cover to not only reflect the sculpture, but somehow include words of the poetry. And the words of this poem I found so delightful that I was able to take those and put them on a path that waves across the page.
Here's a
And
picture of it on the screen now. You can see what she's talking about.
yeah, and those words to me just signaled the delight that a reader might feel when they're looking at this book. And they just worked perfectly to be the introduction to the book. So
Yeah, you did a beautiful job
thank
with
you.
that, Cheryl, or I mean, Jan. Okay, so are we going to the next poem, Cheryl?
Sure.
Okay.
Circle of Life.
What you're going to go to Circle of Life?
Yeah, page 89.
All right. Let me get it up here. All right.
All right.
All right, there you go.
Circle of Life.
Oh,
Let me give a little introduction to this, Cheryl, because this had to do with another project that I did about 2 years ago here in Santa Cruz. As many of you may know, I majored in art and minored in physics, and I was always interested in the connection between intuitive and intellectual ways of knowing. A person who had influenced me a great deal was a man named Leonard Shlain, who wrote a book called Art and Physics. And the premise of the book was that art predicted what science would later discover or verify by 50 to 100 years in advance. An example of that was Rene Magritte's painting of a man with a face on the back of his head. And that painting was painted 25 years before Einstein's theories of relativity would have predicted that if you were traveling at the speed of light, you could see somebody's face on the back of their head because the past and present come together at that point. So anyway, there was a physicist here at the UC who wanted to do a project combining artists and physicists. And obviously I got interested. And so I got combined with a physicist at the Stanford Linear Accelerator, the original linear accelerator in the world over here at Stanford, which is now being used for different, more commercial research purposes. But my way of collaborating was to go into Heinrich Ohlstag's lab and actually work doing sketches while he was running his experiment. So this is one of the sketches that came out of that series. I was over at the lab about 7 or 8 weekends. And what was interesting was the lab, and you can see some of this on my website, was very rectilinear, shiny steel, a lot of noise. I had to wear earphones at one point just to draw. And all of the images that came out of this series were very naturalistic. And I found that interesting. And also I asked Heinrich after the experiment was over, well, what happened? And he said, well, we were experimenting with the speed of magnetism. And I said, who cares about that? And he said, well, we store all our energy on magnetic disks on our computers. And right now we think that it can only go about, let's say, a mile an hour. And if we could get it to go faster, we could store a lot more information. And he said, it appears from this experiment that we may be able to get it to go something like 500 miles an hour now. So anyway, that's the background around this series. It's called the Art and Physics series. It's under projects on my website. So go ahead, Cheryl.
Thanks. It's really interesting to hear some of this. I didn't know any of this when I was doing the writing of the poems. You know, basically Brad just sent me photographs of the sculpture and I went with that. So it's really interesting to hear that kind of background, and I always find art and science to be an interesting relationship. So, circle of life. Drenched in sunlight, you blossom. Boughs return seeds to earth. Sprouts emerge, savor the warmth, arc toward sky, while clutching loam, developing limbs, readying their bows to follow this simple truth, the circle of life.
Great poem. Shall we move on to Death's Embrace?
Sure.
Now, this is another project. This is another piece from my Rosecrans project that was done at the cemetery. And it was interesting. There was a naming session right after this project was completed. Well, actually, a little more about the Rosecrans project. When I first went to the cemetery, I was trying to find the graves of soldiers who had actually died in the wars, not just fought in them. And in earlier wars, they were kind of all buried together, like World War I or something like that. But in more recent wars, like the Iraq War, the Iraqi Freedom, they were just stuck in here or there because the cemetery was nearly full. It's since been closed. So I would go and I was having trouble. There was occasionally iconography like KIA killed in action, which would indicate somebody had actually died in a war. But I was having really problems trying to find these graves. And so in early March of 2003, when we finally entered the war in Iraq, I was driving around in my car and I read in the paper that one of the first 7 people to die in the war was a valedictorian graduate of one of the high schools in the San Diego area, John Matthew Kennedy. And so I said, okay, Brad, it's time to put up or shut up. This is all about intuition. I turned my truck around and I said, I'm going to find this guy's grave intuitively. I drove right to it. There wasn't even grass growing on it then. And that's how I began to find other graves of soldiers who died. So many strange things started happening to me in the cemetery that I finally started keeping a journal, which you can see as a separate website on my website under the Rosecrans Project. And I invite you to read it because so many weird things started happening. I told my wife finally, nobody's going to believe this unless I write it down. And what I didn't realize in sitting with the dead is this darkness starts to enter your life. And by June of 2003, I told my wife, I've got to stop this project or I'm going to have a nervous breakdown or something. So I ended up stopping on July 4th. And there's an informational kiosk there that has this pamphlet that I've been trying to get over this whole 6-month period that has the names of the Medal of Honor winners, the highest award you can get in the military. And they were always closed. And I thought, well, I'm going to go back one more time. So I go back and the door's open. I walk in, they hand me the pamphlet. It's on this big hill and you walk down and there's graves all around it. And I look down and there's a grave And the grave is Medal of Honor winner. Okay. And he's not in the pamphlet. And I'm like, well, I need to go back and tell these people, to put his name in the pamphlet. So I go back and there's nobody there. The building's locked and I'm only a couple 100 feet away. So I thought I'll go down to the administration building and I'll tell them. I go down. Remember, this is the last day I'm going to be in the cemetery. And there's nobody there. And I turn around to leave. And this man walks up to me and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, "Are you here to meet me?" And I was so stunned, I didn't know what to say. And so finally I asked him, "Why are you here?" And he said, "I'm here today to bury my friend who just died in Iraq. It's the last person I met in the project." So anyway, this piece comes from that project. And I wanted to give a little background to it so that Cheryl could, it would give some context to the poem as well. Okay, Cheryl.
Thank you. Death's embrace. Galloped as you have through villages in turmoil, past thrones of kings, one rested blade upon your shoulder. Your armor has seen better days. Your warrior heart steadfast through the years, a mighty prince, submitted queen, you proudly, yet humbly, served all. Conflict of conscience, you marched on, weighed by futility, scarred, yet stalwart you stayed, through days rife with pain, and find yourself now in death's embrace. Your stallion doesn't buck, nor do you wither. Arms wide, you celebrate the embrace, ready for the unknown road ahead.
This is a very interesting piece with the skeleton grasping the soldier in the background. Okay, I'm going to go on to Cartesian travels.
Can I just want to comment. I, the skeleton is, represents death, but the shape of the head, the skull, is a heart. And so it's like there's a loving welcome to death or something. I don't know. I mean, you can take these pieces and look at them again and again and see different aspects. And this is why we all hope our mothers are our biggest fans, but my mom has been reading her copy over and over, and she'll call me periodically and say, "Jan, you just do such beautiful work. Oh, this book is just amazing." Because I think as she's looking at it, she's seeing all these different aspects and thinking about it. And it's been that's it just makes me so happy to look at this now after all of the putting together of it, and to see the depth in this. And it's funny because we talk about we make this comment about everything being positive, but Death's Embrace is not positive.
Right.
But yeah, it is, so we found a way to make it into kind of a celebratory. You celebrate the embrace, so a celebratory event rather than something to fear. So that's so interesting. Thank you for letting me give my take on it.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. That's really, really interesting. I also wanted to tell you a little bit about how these sculptures came to be. I mentioned I had doing sketches for these kind of sculptures for probably 10 years not really thinking of them as artwork, thinking of them as maybe some personal expression. When this Brazilian friend of mine convinced me to put them into clay, I had never worked in this medium before. And I put out the affirmation that I would do about 15 of these and have an individual show, a seemingly ridiculous assertion at the time. And I walked around with it for 2 years in San Diego until one night after an art opening, I was walking home in the dark, and there was just one shop open on the street. It was an electrical fixture shop or something. I was looking in the window, and another man was there, and I started telling him for some reason, I don't know why now, that I was going to do this project, but I didn't have a clue how to technically execute it. And he reached over, put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "I know all the answers." And he told me what kind of clay to use. He ended up firing and what kind of finishes. And the clay in these pieces is a unique type of high-fired clay. Usually high-fired clay has grog in it, which is pre-fired pellets, which make it very hard to get fine detail, but it moderates the temperature. As at high fire, you go up to very high temperatures and then cool down again. So that helps, but this is one of the few high-fired clays that doesn't have any grog in it, so I can get very fine detail. And it turned out he fired these pieces until I moved to Santa Cruz in a kiln, of which there's only one of a kind in San Diego. So a lot of things about my art are very synchronistic, including this project. I just wanted to kind of give a little more background on that. Let's go on to Cartesian Travels. And this one here is it comes from another kind of a project I did. When I was first, I used to work with an environmental consulting company down in San Diego, and they kept changing names and getting bought out, and finally they kicked me out. And so what was interesting was that I finally decided to start my own environmental consulting company, and it was called BEC, Burkhart Environmental Consulting. And in it, I created an art gallery called Bradley Escultor del Corazon. But I spent about 6 months putting out contract proposals and winning nothing. And finally, my wife read that there was this hotel in Paris, which was supported by artists. And she encouraged me to take a break and go to Paris. And a friend of mine bought one of my sculptures. And it allowed me, if you can believe this, at that time, it was $600 round trip from LA to Paris and back. And I went for a week. And a bunch of sculptures came out of this being one of them. And I couldn't quite figure out what the connections were between the pieces, but they did seem connected. And what I had been doing is going into modern art museums during the day, in the morning, and then going into coffee houses in the afternoon and sketching. And I finally ended up at McDonald's because they wouldn't kick me out while I sketched if I didn't order more coffee. But when I got back, I finally got a connection that these pieces all seem to reflect the spirit of different modern art movements, even though that wasn't my initial intention. So this is one. The animals in this, I actually saw the seal-like animals on the ceiling of the Uffizi Gallery when I visited in Florence many years ago. And, this is kind of a chessboard here. So that's where I had named it Cartesian Gambit. And then Cheryl went with Cartesian Travels. But the piece that kind of got me going on this is a piece called Bark of the Fauvus Dog, which when I was looking at it, I realized the Fauvus had never done sculptures and they didn't do animals. But if there had been a Fauvus sculpture doing animals, he would have done this piece. So I invite you to look in the book and check that one out as well. It's called Bark of the Fauvus Dog. Okay, Cheryl, Cartesian Travels.
Thank you, Brad. Cartesian Travels. Night dragon travels across the chessboard of life, wanders through art, logic, circular reasoning, Seal companion barking at his side, he basks in intuitive truth of the natural world, to be had by all. Be you sea creatures or forest frolickers, listen. Find order in nature. Ride the ups and downs. Roll the die as you question each day. Seek the balance, mind, body. Toss the jacks, the queen.
Yeah, this reminded me of that movie, The Queen's Gambit, too. Okay, moving on. The next one is called Warrior Opens His Heart. It's also from the Rosecrans series. And there we go.
All right. A warrior's call. The time of war must end. This breaking apart of structures, systems, symbiosis must cease. With such desire, I open my heart, stretch through to gift that can only be given in peace. Learn with me, please. Teach me, as I teach you, the rhythm of brotherhood, the magic of a mother's love, the growth we all deserve as we create as we create change, the flourishing of fauna, burgeoning of foliage, until the air is filled only with joyful noise, the land rife with life once again.
This seems particularly apropos after this election, I must say. Thank you, Jan. Now, the next one is kind of interesting. And Cheryl actually owns this piece. And what's interesting about it is that it was part of a series that I did to begin with that were half the size of the ones that I work with now. So this was actually the frontispiece for my first website. And the little bombs or whatever at the top up here were buttons that you push to get into my website. And originally I had named this The Enlightened Tiger Story until Cheryl pointed out to me that tigers don't have spots. So we changed this a bit to correspond with the image. So go ahead, Cheryl.
The enlightened leopard. The joy of enlightenment emanates from your being. Your spots glow with it, pulsate, reach all. Crowned with this wisdom, your younger self radiant below, you travel across the savannah with your new bird friend, encounter others, yet difference does not exist. You know the bridge. Show them. Show them the way to one another, how to reach harmony, to grow over and again, to know this joy of enlightenment, all that's seen, all that's not.
Beautiful. And now we're going to go to the last poem of the series, and we'll have then Jan talk a little bit about editing, and then hopefully we can open it up to questions for everybody. So this last one is pretty interesting because this poem was written before Cheryl saw this piece. So the piece didn't so much inspire it as it seemed to fit it. And I'm going to let her talk about that. And then I'm going to make a final comment. But go ahead, Cheryl. Tell
Okay.
about why this is for Mom.
Well, I wrote this poem when my mom passed away. And some of what it's talking about is my travel toward her. I had to fly in to see her on that last day. And when I was doing the book, I saw this sculpture and the title of it, and it spoke to me in that same way that the poem that I had written spoke to me. So I put them together, and I was really pleased that Brad was okay with it, that it worked. And I love the fact that the poem is called Sundown. And
Yeah, I know. So, what was really interesting about this piece is the person who owns it is a neighbor of mine who had taken care of his dying wife for about 4 years. And then she finally died, and he wanted this piece in memoriam of her.
yeah, makes sense. Reborn in Starlight. I love it. I just love it. So this is a poem for Mom, Sundown. Flying above the clouds, watching sundown. More striking than any I've seen, and I know it's you. Making your way toward your last day. And me, not ready to say goodbye. Brilliant sky splashed with the deepest orange against blue and gray. How can I say what's needed? How does one encapsulate 8 decades and me witness to just 6? The mixture of sorrow and grace, a new face given old beliefs, searching for peace, an unknown road, a final link from brilliance to darkness, or perhaps for you, darkness to brilliance.
Hey, I'm going to stop my sharing, and we can go back to hopefully Jan talking a little bit about how her work came together in the publishing of this book, which I think is quite interesting. Again, everything seems to work very synchronistically in my life, so this was meant to happen as far as I'm concerned. So, Jan, what do you have to say there?
Well, there were a couple of things that I wanted to mention. One was that in the process of wanting to do advanced reviews, we all approached folks that we knew, and one of the people that we talked to was Rick Lupert from who hosts Cobalt Poets and is involved with Poetry Superhighway. And he was happy to write a review. And the reason I asked Cheryl to read The Enlightened Leopard is because he mentions that in his review, what's great about asking poets and writers to write you a review is that those become poetic pieces in themselves because they're just so beautifully written. And he says, I wanna own an enlightened leopard or something like that. But
That
uh
sounds like Rick.
pardon?
I said that sounds like Rick.
Yeah, yeah. Um the the a lot of the books that I publish have been just paperback books, and so I have an account with Ingram Spark, and I do those kinds of books. But we needed to do some research to figure out because we wanted this to be a coffee table book with bright, really good quality paper and hardcover and all that. And Book Baby was the obvious choice. So. They were really great to work with, and um, they provided some cool features like being able to have a page on their website where we could, showcase the book and that kind of thing. Um, uh, oh well, I've been accused of spending a lot of time making things perfect. I am a perfectionist, and so I feel like there isn't one single thing about that book that I look at and go, "Oh, I wish I had done this," because we did it all. And so I feel really, really good about that.
And we
Um,
also kind of did it together. We would go back and forth, and sometimes Jan
yeah.
would, oh yeah, I can see what you're talking about. And so yeah.
Yeah. And we and there was a really lovely kind of a symbiotic, and we're all simpatico, and we're also discovering similar thinking about things, and the people that we knew in common. And it was a really lovely way to spend the pandemic, to to have bi-weekly meetings of just getting back and forth, and coming up with new ways that we might approach something. So that was a really positive experience for me.
Also, I think the other thing about Book Baby is that we didn't do it, but they also can put out ebooks and paperback books of the same uh, books that we have already published if you want them to. Isn't that correct, Jan?
Yeah, I think there's some other options that we have not taken advantage of. But
Mhm.
one thing that I do know is that when you self-publish, basically that doesn't come as a package with marketing. And that's true across the board of most of these companies. Some of them say they're going to market for you, and what they do is basically print you some bookmarks and tell you can put it up on their website. And that's about the extent of it. So the actual marketing is in things like Brad's been doing, putting articles in his monthly newsletter, and we've sent out some stuff to we created a mailing list for Cheryl, and so she sent out some invitations to our book launch party. Um, and then doing things like this. Thank you very much, Poetry Society of New Hampshire, for hosting us and allowing us this opportunity to share our information and meet you.
Also, I have put books in several local bookstores, including Bookshop Santa Cruz, which has a local authors program. And a friend of mine told me that, and this may be of interest to some of your people as well, that a lot of libraries have money to buy books of local authors. And if you go into their acquisitions departments on your local libraries and request that they carry your book, they may do that. One of my friends here is a artist who did a remarkable book she self-published of her whole life, and all the artwork she had done, and the local library took it. And actually, there's another library that's going to feature a presentation by her. So I wanted to share that with your members.
And with your publisher.
Yeah.
I think I'll have a visit to some of the San Diego library folks and see if we can. I'll take an armful of books with me. So
Yeah. What do you got to lose is what I say.
right.
Yeah. So, well, did you have more, Jan, or should we open it up to some discussion? We've been going on for about an hour now.
I'm open. Yeah.
Yeah. Jen, you want to take over and orchestrate any questions? Or did she leave us? No,
I'm here. Sorry.
I keep seeing a typewriter instead of your face.
Yeah, I had my video off for some reason, but I was watching the screen and looking at your beautiful pictures. Thank you. Yes, if people have questions, please feel free to ask. We'll try to go one at a time. But thank you guys for sharing all that wonderful information.
Yeah, and just unmute yourselves now so you can all be heard.
Yeah, I think it's a small enough of a crowd. I think we can do it.
Well, thank you all. That was really wonderful and fascinating. I'm curious, Brad, how well, you said that you hadn't worked in that medium before of the clay. I wonder if you've done relief work. I know, Michelangelo said that sculpture works by subtraction and painting works by addition, and he thought there was a big difference between painting and sculpture.
Well, it's interesting. I had never done relief work before, and in fact, it's a very unusual art form. There aren't very many people who work in it. And what had inspired me, interestingly, is when I was an undergraduate, I studied in France for about a 6-month period. And during a Christmas break, I went to Florence, Italy, where I was introduced to Renaissance art. And a lot of people aren't familiar with this, but the term Renaissance was first used by a man named Jakob Burkhart, my name, who wrote the history of the Renaissance in 3 volumes. And it's a cultural history of the Renaissance and the transition from a more spiritual period to a more, scientific era that we live in now. So, no, I had not worked in this, but when I was in Italy, there's a small building in front of the cathedral in Florence. It's called the Baptistery. And it kind of formed the center for Renaissance art because commercial guilds started paying for artwork at that time instead of the church. And there are 4 sets of doors that lead into this octagonal baptismal building. And during the Renaissance, commercial guilds at various points during the Renaissance, beginning with Giotto and moving around to Michelangelo at the end, would pay for competitions for these bronze relief panels that cover these doors. Usually they're big, tall doors. They're about 10 feet high and 6 feet wide. There's 2 of them. And so they represent the stylistic changes of art through the Renaissance. And the last and the greatest competition of the Renaissance was for the doors that face the cathedral. It was won by a man named Ghiberti. He beat out Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And he took something like 20 years to do these 10 panels. And when they were finally mounted on the doors, Michelangelo called them the doors of paradise. And I was so impressed by these that when I came to be thinking about doing my sketches into some kind of art form, I decided I would do clay panels about the size of the Golden Door panels, not in bronze, which is a very elaborate process to cast and create, but I'm not quite sure why I decided on that medium because I had never worked in it before, but it seemed easier than working in bronze at the time. So the original pieces were inspired by these doors of paradise. And what's really interesting is, I don't know how many, you all know Rodin's sculpture, The Thinker, right? And most people think he's a great big huge sculpture because that's how you see him in patios and stuff. But actually the Thinker was only about 18 inches high, and it was designed to go at the top of a gate called the Gates of Hell. And it represents to me the transition from the more spiritually based cultures of pre-Renaissance to this more modern scientific view, which if you always try to answer everything with reason, it ends up in kind of a negative loop. You can't seem to solve things. It's like the gate to hell in a way. So anyway, that I thought it was interesting. These were called the Doors of Paradise, and then Rodin's sculpture, The Thinker, was at the top of an arch called the Gates of Hell. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I did not have a very good command of this medium when I started it. In fact, the smaller piece, the Enlightened Leopard story, was half the size of most of the ones I work in now. And what happened is when you finish these pieces, you carve them out on the back so that they're all about the same thickness all over. So when the shrinking and swelling takes place, the real thick areas cool a lot slower than the thin areas, and so there's often cracks between them. Or if you get air entrapped in the clay, it can explode. So I was having some difficult problems with that, and what I finally came up with was a technique where after I've already carved out the back, I go over the back of the piece with a needle tool, and every half inch I go almost through all the way to the other side. So it ends up being kind of like a waffle in the kiln. Any air or anything gets out. And a lot of people find it they don't even believe I can do what I do in the size I do it because they think it's impossible. And,
how big are they?
well, they're about 3 to 4 inches in some cases, but mostly not that thick overall. But it's fascinating to me that I have no technical training in this, and people are telling me, "Geez, I don't know how you do this."
Can I ask if they are they hung themselves or do people frame them? Like, I'm curious.
I developed a hanging system for the back of these, which is some wooden bars that have metal hangers on them that have a wire that runs in between, so they can be hung right on the wall. And they're glued to the back of the pieces by this epoxy called JB Weld, which is used to repair automobile cracks in automobile engines. But it's one of the few epoxies that when you put weight on it, these weigh about 35 to 40 pounds each, doesn't drift over time. All right. And a lot of people, I've had problems with a lot of galleries. They're like, oh, this is too heavy and that. But actually, it's not much heavier than a mirror on the wall. I can hang most of these with one, and I usually use 2 50-pound picture hangers. So, yeah,
So
that's the hanger.
Brad delivered part of my payment for the work that I did was that he gifted me one of the sculptures. No, not one of the sculptures in the book. He let me pick
Yeah, you
from
got one from the
another.
Art Physics series, I think, didn't you?
I don't remember.
Well,
I mean, I don't know about the series, but I know that I love the piece, and he delivered it personally, and which he can't do to everybody. He just happened to be coming to San Diego. But we looked for where we could hang this, and I thought, oh, it'll fit really nicely in this spot, a little alcove that my husband had created to put our a little fountain, an outdoor fountain, and they're really beautiful outdoor art. I think it works really nicely in your garden and that kind of thing. Well, that wasn't going to work because the back of that was just a very lightweight, what's not even backboard, just a
wouldn't
no,
hold. No.
yeah, I think it was backerboard, something like that, but not strong enough to, pound a nail or do anything like that or screw something in. But we had these beautiful little alcoves that he had created that are flanking a fireplace. outside, and he had built in this little spotlight, and oh my goodness, it's like it just slid right in there, and it leans back against the back of the alcove. And when people are visiting or we're having a gathering, a party, we can turn on the lights and it spotlights Brad's art. And it's just so beautiful. And the piece has some sort of waves that are going on in the base of it. And so I took a little shell, a conch shell, and put that in front of it. So it has this sort of, nature connection or whatever. And so, Brad, I need a piece for this other side of the alcove now, okay?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, it's interesting because when I went to the Biennale, I was invited to the Biennale in Florence, Italy in 2003, which is an international art show. And it was very challenging getting any of my artwork over there. And I had these special boxes built, and I took them on as my luggage on the plane at the time. You could take up to 80 pounds. And they were specially built boxes I could take. And I had to have this special deal where there was a little trap door in one, because when you go through, the security, they want to see what's inside. So there was a little electric screwdriver in there where they could take the top off and see the sculptures. But anyway, I had these boxes, and recently I've started using them. I find it very easy to ship my sculptures by mail in these boxes to anywhere in the United States for basically a couple $100 to ship the box there and return it to me. So if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to sell a piece to someone in New Hampshire. I just sent one to my niece, my wife's niece in Lubbock, Texas, and it arrived fine. And I shipped another one to a buyer in San Diego who had bought the piece down there. It came through fine. So I'm confident it can be done. Although the piece I ended up gifting to Cheryl, I ended up sending in a different way. It wasn't in a properly packed box, and that's the Enlightened Leopard story. And it actually arrived cracked, and I had to instruct her over the phone how to re-glue it back together. But I think it looks just like brand new now, doesn't it, Cheryl?
Yeah, it looks good.
I have
I
a
was
question.
muted.
So I can fix them if they fall. Let's put it that way. But any other questions?
I have a question. But first, I want to say that both the artwork and the poetry was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Mhm.
And I know there's a question in here, but I'm not quite sure how to pose it. Brad and Cheryl, both in your introductions, you both mentioned of Cheryl, you getting something wrong at first, and then Brad corrected you and said, no, it's this thing. And that strikes me as a little, I'm not sure what to make of that. Because I think, Jan, you said you look at them and you see new things every time. And oftentimes with non-representational work, an artist doesn't really want to express what it's about. So, many questions to this. Do you really, when you do these pieces, do you think this is about that? And if somebody thinks it's about something else, they're wrong.
Well, I wanna talk a little bit about my naming process, which is something I've stumbled on and didn't talk much about during the presentation. But I mentioned I had a little gallery down in San Diego where I used to show my work, and it was interesting because this guy walked in one day and he was very excited about this one piece, and he wanted to know the name, and I had forgotten it. And I was kind of hemming and hawing, and then I said, well, if you really, really are excited about the piece, I find people seem to know something about the story. What do you think the name should be, right? So he thinks for a minute. Now, this isn't some collector or something. This is like maybe a contractor or something. Anyway, he cranks his name out. It's exactly the name word for word that I had forgotten. Okay. Well, all my life, I've been taught art is subjective, not objective. And here all of a sudden is something that two people completely agree on, right? And so it started to turn my whole idea of the so-called subjectivity of art around. And so the next thing I did was a show in Tijuana at the art center down there. and I put a naming box up. And I asked people to write down what they thought the name should be for this piece, because I don't know what the things mean. I used to try to name them after what I thought the story was in the piece, but sometimes I couldn't figure it out. And so anyway, all these people put these names in the box, and I come back at the end of the show, and 70% of the people have all put essentially the same name in the box. It's called The Day I Danced with Death. So after that, I began doing these naming groups, which is how I name my sculptures now, where I get 8 to 10 people together after a firing, and we talk and we dialogue, and sometimes we argue, and sometimes people want to leave because they're mad at each other. And the goal is to find the story in the piece as a way to name it. You wouldn't believe it's possible, but inevitably somebody says something and everybody goes, that's it. That's the story. And so that's where the names come from now, by mutual agreement, by consensus. And so we have this idea a lot of times, like I like to say, one of our highest moral values right now is tolerance. And so the way that comes out in the art world is I'll tolerate your point of view, you tolerate mine. But what people don't realize about tolerance is the dark side of tolerance is loneliness, because I'll agree to tolerate your point of view, but I'll never understand you. And you'll agree to tolerate my point of view, but you'll never understand me. Well, what happened in these naming groups was, rather than agreeing to disagree, we agreed to agree. And my observation was that the result of that was an immediate connection between everybody involved. And it was I would call a sense of community. And so to me, that's what art should be about. And I was curious for a number of years about the difference between intuitive ways of knowing truth and scientific ways. The scientist goes through, does an experiment, and then has a theory, and he proves or disproves it. And then, the way they test it is they keep running new experiments, right? Well, how do you do that with intuitive insight? Because Hitler's idea that Aryan superiority was an intuitive insight that created great evil in the world. Well, I came back to the Native American vision question, where they would send the Braves out to get these visions. And when they came back, they would say, okay, the chiefs were sitting around, the leaders of the tribe. Well, did you get a vision? Yeah. Okay. What is it? Okay, you're a man now, you go. But what they don't talk about is what happened to the visions each year after they went through the Braves. And what would happen is the chiefs would sit around and they would decide which of the visions were applicable to running the tribe for the next year. Well, that kind of flips the idea of the artist as the person who has the secret around to a person who has intuitive insight, but doesn't necessarily have something that's valuable to other people. So as artists, we should be offering our work out into the public with the idea that some of it's going to be maybe personal, maybe prejudiced, but not very worthwhile to the general society. But we have a moral obligation to share that. And then society sorts it out. And I like to use Picasso's Guernica painting as one of his greatest, because here's a Cubist painting about the bombing of this village in Spain. And it can be placed in any culture in the world and people get it. That's why it's a great painting, because it connects with all these different levels and cultures of people. So anyway, that's kind of the background. As far as me and Cheryl interacting, it was more, and I do this in the naming session sometimes. People will say, oh, I think it's this, or I think it's that. And I'll say, well, I kind of had this take on it, but I can kind of see your take. But once Cheryl would look at it, a lot of times, an image, she would say, oh, I didn't see that before, or something like that. Or maybe I would say, oh, yeah, like with Joyful Imagination, you got a really brilliant idea here. So it was very interactive process. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how we think. Is that how we work, Cheryl?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
That's kind of how we would work together to sort out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think of specifically about the enlightened leopard and the fact that it was a tiger in Brad's house. And then they discovered, oh, wait a minute, that really logically isn't a tiger. But I can see how with some of the little creatures. I mean, because there's so many creatures going across these relief sculptures that can be identified in multiple ways. And so I can see how, you know, Cheryl might say, you know, your newfound friend, the bird, and then Brad says, well, I meant that to be a bee. So, so.
I'd love to hear from Cheryl what her sort of philosophy of ekphrastic poetry is. Were you trying to sort of discover and elaborate on the story that Brad was telling, or were you using that as an inspiration for your own story?
Um, I wasn't trying to tell my own story. I basically was trying to come together with the art and express what somebody might see in the art. Obviously, you know, I'm expressing what I'm seeing, but I'm also, as Jan was talking about, you know, the little creatures and whatnot. I mean, sometimes I'd have to step back and realize, oh, there's this little bird here, you know. Excuse me. What's the role of this little bird? You know, there are all these little creature friends in Brad's work, and you know, bring that together. So it wasn't really for me. I wasn't trying to tell my story. I was trying to interpret the art, basically.
Yeah. Well, also, just as an aside, during COVID, when there weren't very many shows going on, I began a series called The Sculpture of the Month, which you can also see on my website, where I began to try to explore the imagery in my pieces and how they connected with other mythical and archetypal images in other cultures. And a lot of my early work had imagery from early matriarchal cultures, which I was not familiar with at the time. And I would find out about these images from other people. And it was really interesting to me. I had this one book called, one sculpture called Phrygian Journey. It has a boat with a bunch of snakes on the side and a mast with a fleece on it. And sitting in the boat is this bird with a suit on. And I thought, what the heck is this about? And then this person gave me this book about Greek uh, myths, and there's this story in there about this boat that's rowed into the underworld by these blue jays. And I think that's the boat. That's why it's named Phrygian Journey.
Mhm.
So anyway, but I find when I go on the internet a lot of times and explore some of the imagery in my pieces that there are extremely interesting connections between the imagery in it and other cultures in the world. Like I had this one really frightening piece, and I finally found a replica of it in a Thai mythology. It looked just about like the image in my piece, and I was just fascinated by that. Other questions? I see we have some chats here. Does that have anything to do with anything?
Really, I think it's more links to the websites and the
Website.
book and Book Baby.
Okay.
Um,
Okay, well, I think we're kind of at the end then.
well, thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll
Yes.
clap.
Great.
Thank
Glad
you.
Wow.
Thank you all very much. Really
I
appreciate
I
hosting our.
agree with Liz. That was a great question from Ben. Thank you so much for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I had a similar question, so I was glad in listening to your response and Ben's question, I felt like you addressed it, but yeah, I was curious about the process.
Okay.
Thank you all for having us. This has just been really, really a treat.
You know, I heard